Good afternoon and welcome to today's ACPE Academy webinar. My name is Mark Medwed and I'm the Program Manager at the ACPE. Today is the fourth and final installment of our webinar series about the job search process. Our topic today is interviewing for a first or new position as a CPE supervisor and is once again presented by Richard Thorne, the President of Thorne Consulting. The handouts that Richard will reference today in today's webinar are available for download from the ACPE Academy webpage. You are welcome to submit questions to Richard throughout the webinar. When you move your mouse on the screen, you will see a Q&A button. Click on the button and type your question. Please note that depending on the number of questions that are asked, it may not be possible to answer all of them as part of the webinar. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available for playback from the ACPE Academy webpage, along with a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. It is now my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Richard Thorne.
Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. And as Mark said, welcome to the final installment of the series of 4, with the focus today on interviewing and the various types of interviewing that you might be involved in. Just to lay a groundwork, particularly if you may not have been in the earlier sessions, 3 weeks ago we talked about the idea of setting a vision and developing the tools and tactics that you really needed to move your job search forward and to fulfill the vision for that kind of position that you might really be looking for. We spent quite a bit of time talking about the idea of really getting to know yourself, getting familiar with your background at a pretty good level of detail, and being able to clearly explain to people what your skills, abilities, and accomplishments have been. Certainly now, that sort of inventorying process takes on a new level of reality as you look and say, okay, now I'm actually going to start talking with people about this. 2 weeks ago, we took that just a little bit further and added a couple of components to that. As we talked about resumes and cover letters, but we also talked about the ideas of a tagline and cart stories being illustrations that would better and more clearly tell people what your capabilities were, the C standing for circumstance, the A for action, R for result, and T, if it's used, would be for tie-in. So again, being able to reference those things and bring them forward, and now sort of taking all of those various components and having become familiar with yourself, being very aware of the story you've told in your cover letter and resume, you're now ready to go out and start interviewing. Before we actually get into the various types of interviewing, that is, could it be telephone, Skype, or FaceTime, or face-to-face interviews, whether looking for a new or a first-time position, I'd like to just give you one more little caveat that may very well be helpful, and that is, what are some of the better ways of actually going and looking for a job? And certainly you can use things like, you can use some of the job aggregators like Indeed.com or Glassdoor.com, or you can go to organizations' websites and see if they have positions posted and fill out online applications. And what the experts tell us, while it's nice to have that information, those ways of going about looking for jobs can often be among the poorest. One of the advantages you have as a supervisor looking for work is that you pretty much know that you're in demand. So one of the things that you want to determine, and this is sort of part of that creating a vision, is to really understand as well what it is you're looking for. So you put your time really where it will do you the most good and where you're likely to get the benefits that you want. And the fact that you're in demand sometimes may mean that people will be glad to take you. But what I'm finding is organizations are becoming more particular, and just because you have the credential doesn't necessarily guarantee an offer. So while you're in a very nice position and somewhat unusual position compared to many others, there's still a need to kind of be aware and go for the things you want. So one of the there are basically three ways that, beyond say going online and that sort of thing, that can work well in terms of looking for a job. They're listed here as networking, applying directly, and informational interviews or information interviews. I'm going to reverse that and talk about informational interviews first. This can always benefit us whether we've looked for work before or not. I had a boss years ago that said, interview at least once a year just to find out what's going on in the market, what kind of questions people are asking, and just to keep yourself current and sharp. In some ways, informational interviews do that for you. So it is what it says it is. That is that you're wanting to schedule time with 2 or 3 people who would be in a position potentially to hire someone with your background. They don't need to have an opening, because what you're not going to them looking for work, you're going to them looking for information. And you really want to go in talking to them about the kinds of things that they would be looking for in hiring a supervisor, the kinds of questions typically that they ask in a process, even kinds of things that they may share with you in terms of things that you should be aware of from the side of the applicant going through a process, and the types of things perhaps that you should have ready to go. They may be willing as well to take a look at your resume and just tell you if they think it's doing you justice. A lot of times it doesn't really tell as much of the story about who and what you've done as you might like. So that's the idea of an informational interview. From there, certainly you can launch that into either working with that informational interview source to ask them if there are other individuals they may suggest you talk to, and that expands your network, so that can begin networking. You can also ask them if they know of folks who may be currently looking to hire a supervisor, and that's where you move into applying directly. In either of those cases, the other thing I'd want to do with that individual is ask them if it would be all right with them if I use their name. And now I've got this referral going, and I'm going to use that as I move forward with networking and applying directly. So applying directly, again, is what it says it is. That is, I want to identify the hiring manager. And in that case, I then want to go directly to that person and talk to them about opportunities that they may have. I may know they have one, I may not. I honestly don't care. If it's one of the places that I would really like to work, I want to talk to them directly, and again, use it as an opportunity to present myself and my background. And if they don't have an opening, get a little bit of history from them and begin to determine what the potential might be in the future and how far in the future, so that they may consider me at a later point in time. And I may then ask them if I might just send them a copy of my resume to keep handy on the off chance that perhaps they have an opening in the future. And then again, with those individuals, I'm going to be asking them who they know that may have an opening. Now, the other thing you might do with that idea of applying directly is you might apply simultaneously. That is, filling out the online application. And again, rather than filling it out from one of those job aggregators, it's always better to do it from the employer's site. But as I do that, I may as well, whether I'm notifying them or including a resume or not, go back again to that hiring manager, assuming I've identified who they are, and let them know that I've submitted an application. Human resources is not always the most responsive. And in the case of CPE supervisors, it's just not a group that they work with much, so they don't actually know what they're doing or looking for, and oftentimes, since it's a single position, it's not real high priority. So letting a hiring manager know that you're in the queue can make a difference. Networking would be more, almost anybody that you meet can be a potential networking source. And that is, as I'm talking to people, I'm simply letting them know that I'm available and interested in opportunities. Now, I want to be able to give them, within reason, a couple of key points as to what might make an opportunity attractive to me. So it doesn't appear as though just because it's warm and breathing that I would take it. And then with that, see who they know. Now, I want to continue throughout my career. This is not a one-time deal, but I want to continue to build this network. And the other thing that I want to do with these folks with whom I network is not only have them be somebody from whom I'm getting information. At the end of a networking conversation or even an informational interview, I want to ask them what I might do for them. Just thank you for your time. I appreciate your assistance. Is there anything I might do for you? And again, 9 times out of 10, the answer is no. But there may be an occasion where there is, and the fact that you offered differentiates you, however slightly, from almost anybody else that they're likely to talk with. Excuse me. I've been ill all week, so I'm apparently still doing that, and it's decided now's the time to show up. But let me give you one of the things too that you might do when you think about beginning to look for work, and just say, gosh, I'm not sure when I'm going to look, but I'm thinking maybe in the next few months, maybe the next year, is you may take some of those job aggregators like Indeed or it could be Career Builder, Glassdoor, whatever, and you may register there and begin to get position postings sent to you that match the parameters that you may be interested in. The idea being that you begin to collect information. Excuse me. So that you can begin to see who has had openings. You may get information from those postings as to who a potential hiring manager may be, all kinds of things. So an example, for instance, I pulled an old posting a few minutes ago from December. It happened to be with Loyola Medical Center outside of Chicago. And I went on their website, and it appears as though, I apologize, that the position has been filled. But what I would do now as part of that networking is I looked a little further, got the phone number for the CPE program. I would call the program and just ask them. Some time ago, excuse me, it hasn't been like this. Some time ago, you were looking for a supervisor, and I'm wondering if that position has been filled, and if in fact that person might be you. And if so, I congratulate them. And I then turn them into a networking source. I might find out if they think there's potential in their program, if it's one of those places I'd really like to work somewhere down the road for a second supervisor. I'll keep them in mind. If not, I may see if they know of other places that I might apply. And now I've built a new networking resource. Excuse me. And I begin to go from there. So those are some of the strategies that really help you and make it more likely that you'll get the job that you want, and perhaps get it in a way that's quicker than you may have anticipated. As a big part of this whole process, you get into preparation. So as you think about interviewing, you want to make sure that in fact you're prepared. But as you do that, you also want to kind of control things. Sometimes I think that we make hopefully that gets rid of it. Excuse me again. Interviewing into more than it is. When you really think about it, it's just a conversation. It's people getting to know each other and determining, do we have a match? Just because a situation exists doesn't mean, in fact, that it may be something that you may actually be interested in. So in terms of meeting people, talking to people, getting acquainted, and making people comfortable with who you are, it's really something that you do every day. The only difference is that the topic tends to be a little different if you think about it that way, and that is that the topic is sort of focused on you. But you can reframe that as part of your preparation to think, well, it actually isn't that different than working with a student or visiting with a patient. Because in the end, the people that are interviewing you have a need, they have a pain, they have a problem, and you're presenting yourself as the solution. The same way as you do with a student who may be going through a difficult challenge, or a patient or a family or a staff member who's looking for support. It's the same kind of thing. So while what you're talking about may be different and a little foreign or feel a little bit exposed, it actually isn't that different in terms of from the bigger picture than it is things that you do all the time. Another thing to think about as you prepare for an interview is that you really want everything to be positive. So as you get ready to, say, actually start an interview, whether it's phone or face-to-face, whatever it may be, you want to just kind of check yourself and make sure that you're emotionally and mentally in the right place, no matter what's going on beforehand or what you're anticipating afterwards. Make sure you're in a positive frame of mind. If there are areas where you feel you're vulnerable, make sure that you've clearly put together in your mind ways that you express those vulnerabilities, if you will, as positively as you can. So you want to minimize, for example, just saying no. And so you think about some of those kinds of things as part of your preparation. You think about having all of your tools ready to go. And then as you really think about the interview, if you've gotten to this stage and somebody says, we'd like to have a conversation with you, whatever form, telephone, Skype, face-to-face, what that tells you is that to some degree, depending on where you are in the process, people already see you as qualified. So you're already partway there. And then as you do that and get ready to go, and so you're partway there. Then another thing, as you go, I apologize, that you want to do as well as kind of do a little role playing, even if it's just with yourself, and get comfortable. And there's a handout that describes this in more detail that you can refer to. So I'll just highlight the three major points. Is that as you get ready to interview, part of what you want to keep in mind and sort of have in the back of your mind is that as questions are asked, you want to make sure that you understand what's clearly being asked. And then you want to provide clear and concise answers that are organized, responsive, and easy to follow. And you want to develop those answers from your work-related skills, abilities, and accomplishments. And so that's the context within which you do things. And if you can kind of keep that framework in mind, it can really be helpful as you answer questions. And again, one of the differences environment to environment, my answers would tend to be shorter, briefer, if you would, in a phone interview, more likely than not, than they would in a face-to-face interview where perhaps we have more time. I also want to be aware of my audience and determine if the person or people I'm talking with are people who want the whole story, or if they want the abbreviated form. I have a client I'm working with right now, and a long meeting with her is 3 minutes. But you make more decisions in those 3 minutes than you might in an hour and a half with somebody else. And so with her, it's just the highlights. Okay, that's it. Here's the deal. And some people may be like that, and you just want to know and be aware of that. You want to be aware in every case. Again, this is part of preparation and just becoming aware as to what your nonverbal cues are. So even in a phone interview, if you will, changing my posture, standing up, can change some of those perhaps change nonverbal cues. It may subtly raise or change energy. It may come through verbally as well, but there are those kinds of things to be aware of. Be aware that silence can be a friend or a foe. It's a friend to you when someone's asked you a question and you want to take a moment and actually formulate your answer. Then that's helpful. And it's better to do that than start to answer. Sometimes we feel we have to be so quick with our responses. And then we say something and it's out there. And once it's out there, if it's something we go, oh man, I wish I hadn't said that, you can't really reel it back in. You may be able to, the impression has sort of been made. So silence can be your friend as you prepare to answer a question, and just put it in an organized way that it will be clearly understood. It can be a foe as an interviewer. If I'm good at what I'm doing, there will be times during the interview where I'll just go silent after you've answered a question. My hope is that the silence makes you uncomfortable and you feel the need to fill in the gap. When we do that, we usually make idiots out of ourselves, quite frankly. And that's what somebody is hoping, is that you'll kind of go off script and say something, and in that something will be a revelation, and then that revelation will be something that may well determine whether people move forward with you or not. So those are things to keep in mind. Keep in mind that sometimes you can be too forthcoming. So answer the question, but you're no longer, if this is your first position, you're no longer a student. You're interviewing for a leadership position in an organization, and you need to talk and behave in that context and just keep it in mind. And so you want to really come from that framework. And then again, as part of preparation, determine what your level of comfort is in closing the interview, and at least get comfortable, whatever format the interview takes, with thanking someone for the interview, and then being able to ask them very comfortably, very naturally, what's the next step? Where do we go from here? And so those are just some of the kinds of things that sort of lay the groundwork for what's to follow. And then there are three primary types of interviews that people will do. The things we'll talk about, and I'm just going to highlight a few things here, can also relate one to the other, even though they may not show up on the next PowerPoint slide. But know your audience. That is, have done your homework. If you've not looked at somebody's website, if you've not tried to Google people to sort of learn who they are, shame on you. Remember that your voice is more than just the words that come out of your mouth. It is how people will determine what level of personality, what level of energy you have, and in some ways interpret it as, are you fun? People want to work with people that they think are fun, or said differently perhaps, somewhat like them, but maybe different enough to keep it interesting. On a phone interview, certainly you can have your resume there. You can have the posting perhaps. So all of those things can be there. You can have a list of questions that you want to ask ready to go. And then again, at the end, make sure that you ask what's next. Some of the don'ts pretty obvious. Make sure you schedule this at in a place and a time when you actually can focus on the interview. It is a real interview. Make sure that the setting is quiet and you're uninterrupted, and don't eat, drink, or suck on lozenges or cough a lot like I'm doing during the interview. If you have been ill, for example, and don't want to cancel, what I would suggest in that case, kind of being practical, is that you let them know up front, and just apologize in advance if there's any sort of disruption that's caused. And that sort of takes the edge off it for people. Skype, video, FaceTime becoming ever more popular. People kind of like the idea of being able to see you. It's a new experience for me, I guess, and I'm not that technologically savvy, so it's a little weird, I guess, in some ways to also see yourself. And part of what you want to do there is remember that people can see you, so you would really dress as though it's an in-person interview, and dress for the environment. Make sure that whatever is behind you as well is cleaned up, that you're well lit. Somebody told me the other day that they felt that they came off very dark. And it's interesting because it may seem simple, but it may have sort of a subconscious play on somebody's head that it seems like you're either sleeping or something. And so you just want to be aware of those things. You want to have practiced with the technology beforehand so that you have a good sense of how it works. Typically, Skype or face-to-face, or FaceTime rather, will be more in-depth. More and more people are using it as a group interview, so that there may be, I've had some recently. I think I have one today, actually, where it's a first interview, but they actually, from the organization, will have 9 people on the line. A couple of other little things here when you think about doing Skype and FaceTime, and again, this can seem real basic. Know what your addresses or phone numbers are to connect with those things, so that if somebody says, let's do this, I've had people where it takes them a day or two to figure out how they can be connected. The more ready you are and the better you are at having that information available, the faster the process can go. And also it creates that professional and I'm prepared kind of impression with people. I would suggest, if the organization doesn't suggest it too, that you set up a plan B with them that says, if we're having trouble connecting, here's the phone number you can call to reach me, and we'll just turn it into a telephone interview. It seems about half the time that these sorts of things are to be planned and to be pulled off. The technology has some fault in it, or the operators of the technology, and it doesn't work. The other thing to do is as I'm trying to do here, sort of be aware of the camera and just make sure that you have eye contact and that you're staying connected with the group. Excuse me. And then the last interview, probably the one we're most familiar with, and maybe it's the one we most fear. And more and more, and particularly say as a CPE supervisor, unless it's a situation where people already know you, this face-to-face interview very easily can become a day to a day and a half. There are a whole bunch of different components to what it may include. Again, certainly you want to be well prepared, so you want to be researched out. Another part of preparation is kind of going down a little ways, and that is if they don't provide it, asking the hiring manager, or if it's being coordinated through human resources, for an interview schedule. And hopefully within that, and if it doesn't show it, I would ask them about it. We'll identify the people with whom you're meeting and the titles of those people. And again, I would try to research them a little bit before I got there. Some of them you can fairly easily, others you may not. But if you sort of know backgrounds and history, and are they newer to the organization or have they been there forever, it just gives you a little bit of a frame of reference to work with. Make sure that you're appropriately attired. I will say it's all part of that first impression. A lot of things are decided within about 6 seconds. So I want to create, as someone first sees me, I want to create that first positive impression. I want to have good eye contact. I want to have a firm handshake. I want to have good posture. Part of that learning from my father years ago was that he used to focus on people's shoes. He didn't necessarily care sort of the state of what you were wearing, but what he did look for was the fact that you cared about what you were wearing, because his opinion was, if you don't care about what you have, why should I think you'll care about what you're doing for me? So I'm not sure how much that follows through today, but I think to a degree it probably still does. And again, the more research you can do, the better. It can be kind of embarrassing during an interview to ask a question which is pretty prominent on someone's website. It can also be interesting to go, as you look at websites, and see how easy it is to find, say, spiritual care or CPE, what kinds of information is there, and even just getting a sense of how much it is or isn't mentioned throughout the organization. I'm always fascinated if I go typically to places and you can click on a button called services, and it will list all of these clinical services. And some organizations will list spiritual care, many more will not. And it may not tell me a lot, but it tells me something. And it may be something that it will just cause me later to ask someone a question about it. You want to, as part of your, really part of all interviews, but really think about the kinds of questions that you think someone may be asking. And this again is where the informational interviews would come in handy, because you can ask people, when you're hiring supervisors, what kind of questions do you ask? And even narrowing it from there, what are the 3 questions or whatever that people tend most often to stumble on? And it used to be that the number 1 question for stumbling was to have someone describe for you what they did for self-care. And the answer often came back as just kind of a blank stare. Another question that can often throw people off is, what's your salary expectation? So you want to be ready for that. You want to have that be part of your research as well. But think through your responses. You also want to prepare questions that you want to ask. And there, what I'm suggesting you keep in mind is this idea of a funnel. So you're asking broad questions at the outset, and as you move further in, or as you've asked that broad question, you narrow down. And that you keep your subject matter on 3 headings: opportunities, the employer, and the manager, OEM, opportunity, employer, manager. I'm not asking about compensation. I'm not asking about call. I'm not asking about those kinds of things yet. The interview process is a buyer-seller relationship, and right now you're on the seller side of that equation, working to really interest people in wanting you. Once they want you and they turn around and say, hey, we're interested, we'd like to talk to you about coming to work for us, now I'm the buyer. When I become the buyer, that's when those things like compensation come into play. Also, as you get ready to do a face-to-face interview, you want to bring with you extra copies of your resume. You want to bring your list of references, and there may be other sort of handouts or leave behind things that you want to bring as well. Those would be the 2 main ones. And I guess there, since the word resume is there, don't assume that people have read your resume. and don't insult them by saying something close to, well, if you looked at my resume, it tells you that. That's a pretty big insult. So watch that. Here are a bunch of different questions that are just examples of the kinds of things that people perhaps may ask you. And I'm not going to read through all of them with you, but I would like to point out a couple that some of them may surprise you, some of them may not. But people may very well like to talk to you about your theories of education. Some people may ask you to actually bring or share with have you share with them in advance their theory papers, and they would actually like to read them, and they'll ask you questions about them. Again, when you think about the idea with that, for example, what's really being asked, what they're often looking for is enough overlap and commonality, if there is more than one supervisor, with their theories, but enough difference to also create interest and to sort of expand the student's experience. So that's part of that. What parts of CPE supervision do you do best or worst, poorest? And there, for example, we're thinking about, gosh, I really do well on one-on-one, or I do well on didactics. I don't do so well on completing evaluations on a timely basis. You want to just really kind of put in order of priority when you break down those tasks, what you do. And if there is something you don't do particularly well, and someone were to actually ask you that, you want to have a plan for improvement, or you already want to have a plan in place, a strategy for improving that, so that it doesn't just hang there as some kind of a weakness. And don't make it sound bigger or worse than it actually is. And so that's true as well. What is your salary expectation? So know what sort of expectation you have. And if someone were to ask you that question, answer it in a range, not a number. In other words, I'm not going to say, well, 70,000. I may say something to the effect, and I don't want to give a number lower than I would accept. So if 70 is as low as I would go, I might say, well, I'm looking for something between 70 and 74, 70 and 75. I'm not going to say 70 and 80 or 70 and 85 or something like that. Then it makes it seem like I don't actually know what I'm looking for. So it has to be something that someone knows I've done my homework and what I am looking for. And just be aware that human nature being what it is, organizations being what they are, most of the time people will work their best to go toward the low end of those things. Excuse me again. Another thing to think about is if you've had to terminate or discipline a student. And I would turn whatever that experience was into a CART story. It's going to talk about leadership. It's going to talk about challenge. It's going to talk about how you're able to deal with difficulty. So you want to be ready to talk about, in a meaningful way, those kinds of things. I had someone recently actually ask that question of someone, and they couldn't answer it. They had actually never terminated anyone, but it so threw them that they just couldn't come up with anything coherent. And it just really kind of left an impression that maybe this person, in terms of dealing with adverse circumstances, might be more challenged than they would like their supervisor to be. So those are kinds of questions that could be asked of you. These are some of the kinds of questions that you might like to ask. And again, these could be throughout the interview process. So telephone, Skype, or face-to-face. And again, thinking in terms of opportunity, employer, and manager. Think about, as you plan your questions, what's your vision? In other words, what are your priorities? What's important to you? And plan your questions accordingly so you're really getting meaningful information. Keep in mind that idea of the funnel, or general to specific. The thought there is, one, sort of shows that you have an organized way of thinking if you move through questioning in a logical fashion. The other piece, and it is that if the big picture is off, it doesn't make any difference what the little details are. If it's not sort of at the global level a nice fit, a good match, it really doesn't make any difference if we both like Chinese food. It's not that important when everything is said and done. It would be nice down the road, but it's not that big of a deal. Also, as you think about your questions, think about sort of past, present, and future, and not having too many of your questions past focused. That is, what problems have you guys had? Why did the last person leave? Those in some way, they're all past questions, and to a degree, some of those are important to get a history and a sense of what the environment is. And future questions, how can I get promoted? What kind of training opportunities are available? Those kinds of things. Those are important as well. But if I spend too much time in either one of those arenas, it leaves the impression that I'm not necessarily interested in what's right in front of us, and that's the present. So I was trying to think about it in terms of percentages. I probably want 60% of what I'm talking about with somebody, maybe even more, to really focus on the current opportunity and just dabble on the fringes with those other items of past and future. Two more little tips as you think about the idea of asking questions. Ask only one question at a time. And I think further on in the list here, there's one that I can show you where it really is, it's two questions in one, and I would actually want to ask one and then stop and ask the other. You may have a sub question or two for each of these, and so that's why as you go into the interviews, if you have 3 or 4 questions under each heading, opportunity, employer, and manager, you may have 12 or 15 questions there if you have a chance to actually ask them, or if all that information becomes meaningful or is meaningful to you. So ask one question at a time, and try not to start questions with the word why. When we often start a question with the word why, it leaves the impression that there's a predetermined judgment, and it can put somebody on the defensive. I mean, you can just think about it and go, oh, why is that? And right away, you kind of rankle somebody's hackles, I guess, if that's still an expression. So you can see here possible questions that you might ask, and you can certainly come up with more that focus on the position. The biggest one really being is to get a clear understanding of what the job really is and what the component parts of it are. In other words, if I think about it or break it down simply, I might have 3 headings for the potential: supervision, chaplaincy, and administration. And administration for me would mean something beyond administration of the CPE program. So I just want to understand sort of how much time I spend and focus and energy I spend in each of those worlds. Excuse me again. As we think about the E part of things, we're looking at the employer. Now, the employer can be potentially at least 3 different things. It can be the organization itself. It can be the department that you may be part of, or it could be more program or CPE program specific. And so you can see some of the wording here kind of walks between some of those things. And again, looking to find out sort of what some of the program priorities are, perhaps what some of the challenges have been, and just in general, and the program priorities really are based sort of on that larger organizational or departmental priorities, and how people perceive things. Is CPE perceived as a nuisance or is a frustration to people because it's another group of students? Is it something that's really valued and supported? So those are some things that you can look at and consider in talking with them potentially, talking to people about the employer. And then the last area of OEM is the manager, and that is the person with whom you'd be working. And this is pretty important. So it's like, okay, so part of that, and this may go back to the employer or it can come under the manager, is that you may want to understand the structure and what reporting relationships are. Not only those that are formal, but perhaps the informal relationships as well. With a manager, part of what I may want to know, I've looked at this and thought this may not be the best way to ask this question, but I would really like to recognize that I'm not going to do everything perfectly the first time. And so it's sort of like, how do we work with mistakes? Or if something goes wrong, what do we do about it? And that not only would have to do with you, but it would also have to do with perhaps how your supervisor will respond to students who make mistakes. And it may even go beyond that, just sort of even culturally, how does the organization deal with mistakes? So if a student somehow commits a faux pas in the ED, you know, what's the fallout going to be, and what are some of the ways that we can, one, minimize those things, but two, kind of work them through in an appropriate way. And so you just, again, it may not be important to you. It probably would be to me. I may want to know about changes that the department or the program have gone through, particularly recently. And again, some of that, there'll be a lot of things that I could learn indirectly from that kind of information. And then I'm always going to ask someone, what is it that I could do in my role to make your job better, make your life better, make you look better? So there's a case of I need to pick one of those and not ask all of those. It'd be like, what could I do to make your life a little easier as the manager? And go from there. So those are some ideas of questions that you might ask. Now, one of the things to keep in mind as you prepare to ask questions is that any one of those questions, and again, a skilled interviewer would do this, could flip them back on you. That is, oh, that's a good question. The biggest challenge we've gone through in the last year. Well, tell me, what's the biggest challenge you've experienced in the last year? And remember, keep it professional. This is about your work. But somebody could easily do that. So you want to just be aware that as you ask questions of people, you already want to know what your answer would be to that question as well. And then the last thing, and there's other stuff, but we'll sort of wrap it up here and take questions, I think, in a minute or two, is that you always want to ask a closing question. We talked about it earlier as we sort of looked at the different types of interviews, but that is, we're wrapping up, and oftentimes when things do wrap up, and this is particularly true, say, in Skype and telephone interviews, but it can be in person as well, people will kind of wrap it up. Thank you very much. Really appreciate your coming, and we'll be in touch. And they just sort of control it, and in a way you can begin to feel a little bit eased out the door. Now, this will vary perhaps depending on who I'm talking with, but assuming I'm talking with the hiring manager here at the end, at the very least, you want to ask, what's next? Or said differently, where do we go from here? What is the next step in the selection process? But something like that. Now, once I have that answer, if I'm interested as well, I may ask, in what sort of timing are you dealing with? And then my third question for that probably would be, So once I know the timing, would it be all right with you if I then contact you this Friday sometime afternoon to find out what you've decided? Sure, great. May I have your card? Now I give, I have their card, I have their contact information, and I will do that. But even if I don't ask those follow-up questions, the closing question again would be, what's next? In doing that, what I do a couple of things. One is I actually know what the next thing could be, so maybe it gives me a little peace of mind. Two, it also lets them know that by asking, I'm interested. If you don't ask for follow-up, people may assume that you're not very interested. I've often likened it to dating, where it's kind of like you walk to the door. People still do that. And you say goodnight and say, well, thanks, that was nice. And you turn around and go away. Well, that left an impression that, okay, it wasn't actually so nice and it won't happen again. Versus, wow, I had a really good time. I'd love to do this another time. And that's kind of what I'm doing in asking the question about what's next, is I want to leave that impression that I'm interested. And even if you're thinking, gosh, I'm not sure I'm that interested in this position, or maybe not as interested as I once was, I still want to ask the question, because if I don't, I can't do it later. I want to do it now. And then whatever my hesitation is, I want to take the time in between to take those assumptions that I've drawn during the interview and see if I can put those assumptions into some questions that I can follow up and confirm or deny. Just because I'm asking what's next doesn't mean I've just accepted the job. So those are different things. So that's just I guess a couple more things around sort of the interview itself. I just mentioned, for example, turning assumptions into questions. Remembering that questions you ask may be asked back at you. The idea of the buyer-seller relationship, and that whole idea, really, when you're asking questions, although it may seem odd, you are still selling, because you are creating a level of interest and creating that impression with people that you have a genuine interest. If somebody finished and said, do you have any questions for me? And you said, nope, I don't have any. Well, my assumption is you're not even interested enough to think about it. So we're probably not that interested in you. Remain positive and recognize that there may be some kinds of weird things that people might ask you to do during the process, or what may seem weird to you. Some people kind of feel funny about the idea of, gosh, they want to read my theory papers. What's the relevance there? Another thing people are more and more asking for is they may ask for writing samples. And it's not so much academic writing as it is administrative writing. And it's very common for people to have you do an abbreviated didactic, so a half an hour to 45 minutes with questions, and really getting a sense up close and personal, if you will, of how you interact with students. So just some different things to be aware of, some different things to keep in mind, and kind of giving you a quick overview, if you will, of the interviewing process, giving you enough now to perhaps think about things a little bit differently or in a little bit more comprehensive way. Certainly this isn't the answer to all of the questions about interviewing, but hopefully it's a nice framework to begin to work from. There are some slides that you have access to that will give you some ideas on post-interview follow-up. Again, I would suggest you consider it. It is something that's kind of a lost art these days. If you do it, again, it will differentiate you from a lot of other people out there. And if you differentiate yourself and people are more attracted to you, part of what that can do is mean when you're talking compensation that they will actually then be more interested in that example I used of 70 to 74. They may come in at 71.5 or 72 because they're like, man, this person's good. We don't want to lose them. So that's what we have today in terms of interviewing, session 4 of 4. open for questions, and as well just want to thank you for giving me the opportunity not only to be part of this webinar series, but to hope, to have perhaps worked with some of you in the past, and hopefully to work with all of you in some form or fashion in the future. It's really my honor and privilege to do that. So thank you. And if there are any questions, now's the time. And if there are none, I'm just going to assume that that was so thorough and well organized.
All right, thank you, Richard, and thank you to everybody for attending today's presentation. And as a reminder, the recording of the webinar and the PowerPoint slides and handouts will be uploaded to the ACPE Academy webpage on the ACPE website under the Resources tab. A question just popped in. So we'll go ahead and then we'll close out.
Sure. The question is, any good tips for thank you for the interview notes? So I assume that what you're asking there is as a follow-up, and it sort of depends where you are in the process. As far as the the first thing in particular, one is you have to decide who gets one of these first of all. And if I did a group interview and I don't have people's contact information, I'm not going to worry about that. So I'm going to look at it from the perspective of being able to send something most particularly to the hiring manager. And what I'm going to do is just, again, thank them for the time, thank them for the opportunity, reinforce my enthusiasm for the opportunity, and reinforce my interest in moving to the next step. Now, the only other thing that I might add, so again, it's only going to be 3 or 4 sentences. It's not going to be a big, long deal. The only other thing I may add, and you want to do this cautiously, is if there's something that you wish or have thought in the interim that you had said that you didn't, you might add that in. So if you, for example, there's a particular question that somebody asked and you go, oh man, I forgot about this. Well, you might just say, one of the things that, in response to this question, as I was driving home, I thought of this other thing I thought you might be interested. And I'm just going to kind of plug that into the middle and use what we call that sandwich method. So it's like, thank you, very appreciative, really sounds like an exciting opportunity. Oops, I wish I had told you this, and really looking forward to the next step and potentially becoming your next CPE supervisor. I don't want to say I'm the perfect candidate or anything like that, because that's really presumptive and we don't know enough about their situation to know that in fact will be true. But I do want them to know I'm an outstanding candidate. So I hope that helps.
Okay, thanks everybody once again. Thank you, Richard, and wishing everybody a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you all.